the food system is also very implicit, both in the problem around sustainability, but also in the solution. And so sort of being able to bring those arguments together, I think is a really powerful way to move forward and think about food system change. When you talk about food security, there tends to be a standard global north, global south, developed, developing country, economic component to the analysis. And I think that the more research you do around the world, the more you realize that you have the same questions and problems within countries as well as globally. So you can look at the UK and you can look at food poverty in the same way that you could look at the role of sort of really rich consumers in a South African context, for example. So I think that there are definitely differences geographically, but I think some of the similarities that are almost unexpected from the dominant discourse or paradigm, I think those are actually a little bit more interesting to unpack. Right, the complexity of the food system, sort of you nudge one lever here and the whole thing changes, for example, can allow people to disengage, right? Doesn't actually give you a sense of agency or ownership over the kind of change that you might actually be able to see. And so I think there are then two streams that we need to do from an action-oriented perspective. And the first one is actually think about visioning of futures or scenarios, which is sort of one of my main focus areas, is what would a desirable food system look like in the first instance? And sort of recognize that we all have a diversity of opinions as to what that is, and that different food systems are going to be more appropriate to different parts of the world, for example. And so once we actually put down on paper and recognize that there are these differences, we can then start to think about sort of acknowledging that it's not necessarily a right or wrong pathway, but that we just have different perceptions as to what we think of as desirable. And then start thinking about, well, what are the actions that might help to get us there? Also with diversity comes into the corporate sector about diverse forms of businesses that can actually be in within the food system. So not a consolidation of sort of only a few key actors, but actually opening up into a variety of different actors that can actually specialize in different components. So focusing on diversity and thinking about where within the food system we can actually unpack this is, for me, a really important way of moving forward, and thinking about innovations in that space, recognizing the diversity of knowledges that we actually need to move forward. In some way, food can touch on virtually every aspect of our existence. And I think one of the clearest examples of that is in the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, where they've actually been able to link the food system to every single one of those goals. Right, so that just shows you how big you can really exploit it. And I think that that's where the difficulty, specifically for policy, comes in, because you either talk about food engaging in every different sector, whether it's agriculture or water or environment or health. Those are just very simple ones, but it even extends into transport, for example. Or do you just focus as food and try and fit those different sectors under this broader umbrella? And I don't think there is a right or wrong answer to that, because it is complex. And I think that that's something that we're really trying to grapple with now, is now that we've sort of really understood the complexity and the systemic nature of the food system, is how can we think of governing it better, not just within government policy, but also how businesses can engage with that. We'd probably have to come back to this notion of diversity and to really challenge people engaged in the food system to think about how they might be cultivating or limiting diversity in the kind of work that they do. Because I think that's relevant for businesses, from inputs through agriculture, processing, all the way through to restaurants, as well as policymakers, to make sure that we're not narrowing down our options, that we're actually thinking about multiple different contexts and sort of different ways of looking at things. And this is not to say that diversity means we need to just have keep on opening up everything. It's not about a plethora. Efficiency is also important in some ways, but I think that there's that we don't think about it necessarily enough. And I would challenge them to really unpack diversity. Recently, over the past, let's say, 5 years, we've seen large-scale civil society movements around the world around specific issues. So everything from Black Lives Matter, sort of dealing with racial inequalities structured within the US, but that's been applicable globally, through to Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, which started in South Africa, but which also kind of went forward as a need for decoloniality, to sort of really recognize colonial past and how research in particular needed to be done better, through to Extinction Rebellion, for example, or Fridays for the Future, which is sort of bringing an environmental component into sort of civil society movements and practice. And you can see how increasingly gender-based violence, the Me Too movement, all of that has been another really important framing. And you can think of, well, what has the Me Too campaign got to do with the food system, for example? But actually kind of the rooted embeddedness of the patriarchy of gender roles have a really important implication in the food system, where mothers are supposed to be seen as these carers and providers who cook nutritious meals. And now that they're going to work, kids are sort of relying on processed foods, for example. So quite often the burden then sort of gets put back onto women, for example, as a sort of very minor point. And so actually you were seeing these different movements finding each other and sort of finding the linkages that how the Me Too movements around sort of gender-based violence and sort of female emancipation against the patriarchy is also strongly linked to Black Lives Matter, and in particular around the oppression that Black women in particular sort of face on a day-to-day basis. But that's also linked largely to the environmental movement too. And so there's this notion of intersectionality, that actually these movements of concern that we see happen globally are actually tightly connected, and that we need to stand together if we're actually going to affect some kind of transformative change towards a better society globally. And if we think about intersectionality in that way, the implications, I think, for the food system are quite clear, because they are to do with gender. They are to do with colonial past. The food system is also very implicit both in the problem around sustainability, but also in the solution. And so sort of being able to bring those arguments together, I think, is a really powerful way to move forward and think about food system change.